Night fell over Mortain, and the sky was still burning. German artillery thundered in the distance, lighting the horizon with orange veins. In the shattered fields below, a Sherman tank lay crippled, tracks twisted, armor scorched, smoke leaking from its turret. Around it, the ground was littered with metal, mud, and silence. Sergeant Peter Wrench Kowalski stood beside the wreck, his face blackened with grease and soot. His unit had already pulled back. The order was clear: abandon everything that couldn't move. But he didn't move either. He just stared at the tank, at the wreckage that had once been his crew's home. A private called out, "She's done, Sarge. Leave it." Kowalski didn't answer. He ran his hand along the armor, feeling the cold steel as if checking for a pulse. "She ain't dead yet," he muttered. He pulled off his gloves, grabbed a wrench, and climbed inside. The interior was chaos. Wires hanging like vines, shattered gauges, the faint smell of fuel and death. He dragged out what was left of the driver, said nothing, and started working. Through the night, under sporadic shell fire, he welded, hammered, and cursed. He scavenged parts from 3 other wrecks nearby. A track wheel from one, an engine valve from another. Sparks flew like fireflies. The sound of his torch echoed through the valley, defiant and strange. Men in nearby foxholes watched him from afar. Some whispered that he'd lost his mind. Others swore he was performing a kind of ritual, a man trying to resurrect the dead. Rain began to fall just before dawn. The tank sat half open, patched together from the remains of its brothers. Smoke still drifted from its exhaust. But now there was a rhythm to it. A heartbeat. Kowalski climbed onto the turret, turned the ignition, and slammed his palm against the starter. The engine coughed, sputtered, then roared, deep, raw, alive. From the hills above, soldiers turned their heads. A tank that had died 12 hours earlier was moving again. Kowalski grinned through the smoke. "Told you," he shouted, voice hoarse. "She just needed convincing." By midday, that same resurrected tank would roll back into battle, missing armor, black with soot, and destroy 2 Panthers before the sun went down. The legend of the mad mechanic had begun. In most war stories, when a tank stops moving, that's the end of it. The crew climbs out, the fire consumes what's left, and the machine becomes another blackened husk on the battlefield. Soldiers pass it without looking twice. In the language of war, a dead tank is just that, dead. But to men like Peter Kowalski, that idea was nonsense. He used to say, "A tank's like a man. Sometimes it don't die, it just don't feel like getting up yet." His officers called him reckless. His peers called him insane. But the longer the war dragged on, the more they realized his madness kept them alive. The myth of finality, that once a tank was hit, it was finished, existed mostly for comfort. It helped soldiers move on from the wrecks and the friends trapped inside. But on the ground, in the mud and smoke, machines were rarely beyond saving. In Normandy alone, more than 60% of Allied tanks labeled destroyed were later recovered, rebuilt, and sent back into combat, sometimes within a single day. Some came back again and again, stitched together with scavenged parts and luck. Kowalski knew that better than anyone. He had seen tanks burn, only to find that the engine still turned over. He'd patched torn armor with boilerplate, sealed coolant leaks with soap, and welded cracks using scrap metal from destroyed Panthers. He didn't see wreckage. He saw potential. That mindset made him dangerous and indispensable. When other mechanics waited for orders, he moved. When officers wrote tanks off as losses, he went looking for tools. And when everyone else saw insanity, he saw opportunity. He worked like a man possessed, crawling under shell fire to reach broken machines, dragging parts through mud, cursing at steel like it could hear him. His unit began to whisper stories, that Kowalski could bring a tank back from the dead. At first, they said it with sarcasm. Then, after Mortain, they said it with awe. Because that night, when the charmer came back to life, everyone saw something they couldn't explain. They saw a man defy the final rule of mechanized war, that death was permanent. And for the first time, soldiers began to believe that maybe the line between madman and miracle worker was thinner than anyone thought. By the summer of 1944, the 2nd Armored Division had become a moving factory. Its tanks, trucks, and half-tracks stretched across the French countryside like an industrial organism, all steel nerves, oil veins, and roaring hearts. Every mile forward left behind a trail of broken machines, smoking engines, and shattered tracks. The tank war in Europe wasn't about glory or marksmanship. It was about maintenance. A single armored division carried nearly 500 tanks and vehicles. And every day, 30 to 40 of them went down, sometimes to enemy fire, more often to the slow, invisible killers, mud, heat, and friction. The numbers were staggering. Each Sherman tank contained over 20,000 mechanical parts, and anyone could stop it cold. The 2nd Armored's field repair crews worked in 12-hour shifts that stretched into 30. The ordnance trucks followed the battle line like vultures, dragging wrecks out of craters, stripping parts from one to save another. They called it the Iron Harvest. Behind the front, repair yards bloomed overnight, chaotic jungles of torn metal, welding sparks, and shouting men. They had cranes made from logs, work tables carved from destroyed barns, and generators patched together with aircraft parts. The air stank of gasoline and sweat. In that chaos, men like Kowalski thrived. He wasn't just a mechanic, he was an alchemist. He could listen to an engine and tell which cylinder was failing. He could pull a transmission from a burned-out wreck and fit it into another tank before dawn. His tools were mismatched, his methods unorthodox, his results undeniable. The Army's manuals said a full engine replacement required 12 hours. Kowalski could do it in 6, under artillery fire. To his commanders, he was both an asset and a problem. He disobeyed procedures, cursed officers, ignored safety rules. But when a tank he'd worked on rolled back into battle, nobody argued. "Every machine has a soul," he once said. "It just needs a reason to keep fighting." That belief made him infamous among both mechanics and tankers. Some called him Saint Wrench. Others just called him crazy. By August 1944, his name carried across the division. If a tank was beyond saving, send it to Kowalski. He'd either fix it or die trying. And then, at Mortain, he met his masterpiece, a Sherman so broken it should have been abandoned. Instead, it became the proving ground for his madness, a patchwork monster built from the remains of others. In the war of machines, he was no longer just a mechanic. He had become the patron saint of impossible repairs. Wars are remembered by battles and generals, but won by the numbers no one talks about. In 1944, the Allied armies in France were burning through machinery faster than any factory in the world could replace it. Steel didn't die from bullets alone. It died from friction, dust, and exhaustion. The numbers were merciless. A tank engine lasted, on average, 7 to 10 combat days before seizing or overheating. Tracks wore out after just 250 miles of movement. Gearboxes cracked from the shock of rough terrain. Every push forward left a trail of broken armor that outnumbered the dead. The 2nd Armored Division's reports were filled with equations of destruction. 40% of its mechanical failures came from clogged filters and transmission burnouts. Each repair meant crawling under 40 tons of metal, often while shells fell overhead. Recovery crews were exposed targets. 1 in 4 ordnance men was wounded or killed during retrieval or field repair. And yet they kept working. They had to. Factories could ship new tanks across the Atlantic, but it took weeks. Repairs done in the field could put a tank back into battle within hours. Every hour mattered. A single Sherman repaired under fire might save an entire infantry platoon pinned down by a German gun line. That was the quiet arithmetic of the mechanics' war. They didn't count kills. They counted revolutions per minute. Every division carried its own rolling workshop. Cranes, lathes, and welding rigs bolted to trucks. They could turn a field of wrecks into a functioning armored column overnight. It wasn't strategy. It was survival by logistics. Kowalski's section worked 12 hours on paper, 18 in reality. They slept beside their engines using tarps as blankets. Coffee and gasoline shared the same smell. Their uniforms were permanently black from oil. He had a saying, "If you're sane, you hide. If you're crazy, you fix." And in that world, sanity was a liability. The job demanded madness, the kind of devotion that ignored fear, exhaustion, and common sense. Some men shot back when fired upon. Mechanics like Kowalski kept turning wrenches while shrapnel rained around them. To them, a running engine was worth more than cover. By the time August ended, every working tank in the division owed its life to someone like him. And when the Charmer broke down at Mortain, it was only natural that he refused to let it die. He wasn't chasing glory. He was chasing balance. One more machine pulled from the abyss. One more equation made right. The rest called it insanity. He called it maintenance. Mortain, August 7th, 1944. The night was red. The German counterattack had broken through parts of the American line, and the 2nd Armored Division was barely holding. The air smelled of cordite and wet soil. The sky flashed every few seconds from artillery fire that never stopped long enough to call it night. In the middle of that inferno lay a wreck. Sherman M4, serial number 303568. Crew name painted in white cursive on the side. Charmer. Its right track was shredded, one side sunk into a crater. The turret blackened from a near miss. The crew was gone. 2 dead, 1 wounded, 1 missing. Sergeant Peter Wrench, Kowalski, stood over it with a flashlight and a 1,000-yard stare. Command had already ordered all damaged vehicles abandoned before dawn. But he ignored the order. He climbed onto the hull, pried open the engine deck, and stared into the black heart of the machine. The governor was cracked. The radiator was leaking. The differential was split like a bone. Any sane man would have walked away. He didn't. Instead, he grabbed his torch and began scavenging. From a nearby burned-out Sherman, he stripped an intact carburetor. From a half-destroyed German Panther, he ripped out a road wheel. From a rusted T-34 wreck left by the French resistance, he stole a gear coupling that almost fit. It didn't matter that none of it matched. He'd make it fit. He worked through the night like a man possessed. Sparks burst across the field as he welded steel to steel, muttering to himself in a mixture of English and Polish. Each blow of his hammer sounded like defiance. At one point, a private from another unit crawled up to him through the mud. "You can't fix her, Sarge," the boy said. "She's done." Kowalski didn't even look up. "Then so am I." He reworked the drivetrain by hand, cutting alignment joints with a hacksaw, sealing coolant leaks with melted soap. He used engine oil for welding lubricant and his own jacket as padding for a broken suspension spring. All around him the battle continued. The crash of artillery, the scream of shells. Tracer rounds tore through the darkness, lighting up his silhouette like a ghost at work. Men in nearby foxholes swore they could hear him talking to the machine. "Come on, girl. You ain't quitting on me. Not yet." By dawn, his eyes were bloodshot, his body shaking from exhaustion and fumes. He crawled up to the turret, pulled the starter handle, and waited. Nothing. He hit it again. A cough. Then another. Then the deep, ragged growl of an engine catching fire and life. The Charmer was breathing again. The sound cut through the fog like thunder. Soldiers turned to see the impossible. A tank everyone had watched die crawling forward. Smoke pouring from its seams, the engine roaring with fury. Kowalski grinned, teeth black with soot. "Told you she still had fight in her." That morning, the Charmer re-entered the battle, limping but alive. In less than an hour, it destroyed 2 German Panthers that had ambushed an infantry column. When it rolled back into camp, men lined the road, clapping, laughing, shouting. Someone painted new words on its side in thick white paint. "Built by madness." The miracle of the charmer wasn't divine. It was mechanical chaos that somehow aligned. Every decision Kowalski made that night, every improvisation, every part stolen from a dead tank, should have destroyed the machine. Instead, the mistakes canceled each other out. When engineers examined the charmer weeks later, they couldn't believe it had run at all. The left suspension used a panther wheel welded onto an American bogie arm. The gearbox alignment was off by nearly 3 degrees. The engine mount was replaced with steel rods scavenged from a T-34 frame. None of it matched regulation. And yet, in performance trials, the tank outmaneuvered standard Shermans. It turned tighter, climbed faster, and absorbed recoil more smoothly. How? Because Kowalski's mad rebuild had accidentally rebalanced the machine. The asymmetry reduced track tension on rough terrain, the mismatched suspension spread weight differently, and the improvised gearbox shift created a more aggressive torque curve. He had, unknowingly, solved one of the Sherman's biggest weaknesses: poor traction and unstable cornering. It wasn't precision that made it work. It was error, multiplied by instinct. The charmer became an engineering anomaly, a Frankenstein machine whose flaws gave it new life. In modern terms, its mechanics called it feedback harmony, small deviations that accidentally reinforced one another instead of collapsing the system. Detroit engineers later ran the numbers. Statistically, a configuration like Kowalski's had a 1 in 10,000 chance of functioning, a 1 in a million chance of performing better. But it did both. Some said it was luck. Others said it was obsession. Kowalski would have said it was just stubbornness. If it moves, it works. If it works, it fights. The result was a tank faster, steadier, and stranger than anything the manuals allowed. It wasn't supposed to exist, but it did, because one man refused to accept that machines die just because people tell them to. And the moment that engine roared back to life, something in the 2nd Armored Division changed. The mechanics began to look at wrecks differently. They stopped seeing corpses and started seeing puzzles. Kowalski's madness had rewritten the math of the battlefield, not through theory, but through defiance. After Mortain, the charmer became a ghost story on treads. Soldiers whispered about it in foxholes, mechanics swore by it in workshops. Every man in the 2nd Armored Division knew the tale of the tank rebuilt in the dark by a madman who wouldn't quit. When it rolled out again weeks later, patched and repainted, it no longer looked like a Sherman. Extra track links welded to the sides gave it a jagged, armored grin. The German road wheel on the left side spun like it belonged there. The mismatched paint, American olive, Soviet green, and panther gray, gave it a strange, almost predatory look. It was ugly, but alive. The crews who drove it said it moved differently. It responded faster, turned sharper, and felt lighter on rough ground. When they fired the gun, the recoil didn't shake the hull as violently as before. Nobody could explain why. They just called it Wrench's monster. Kowalski stayed with it, riding as its chief mechanic and gunner. He refused to hand it over to anyone else. To him, it wasn't a vehicle anymore. It was something between a comrade and a confession. "She's part of me now," he said, and everyone believed him. Through the fall of 1944, the charmer fought across northern France and into Belgium. It became the first tank to break through the Siegfried Line in its sector, survived 3 direct hits, and was still operational by the end of the month. Infantry units began calling it the lucky tank. The mechanics corrected them. Not lucky, stubborn. Each time it returned from battle, it bore new scars, bullet holes, scorch marks, missing panels. Kowalski patched them with whatever he could find: sheet metal from burned-out trucks, armor from enemy wrecks, even door panels from a French farmhouse. Every repair made it stranger and stronger. By November, the legend had outgrown the man. Commanders joked about bottling whatever fuel kept Kowalski running. He worked until he bled, slept beside the tank, and refused medical leave even after shrapnel tore through his arm. "She needs me," he said simply, and went back to welding. The charmer became a symbol of the division's spirit. that no machine, no man, no unit was ever truly finished. When morale dropped, soldiers pointed to it and said, "If that thing's still fighting, so can we." It was more than a tank. It was defiance made of steel and sweat. And somewhere inside its patched armor, amid the dents and scorch marks, lay the quiet proof that madness and genius were sometimes the same engine, just tuned differently. December 1944. The Ardennes. Snow swallowed the roads and the sky hung heavy with gray. The 2nd Armored Division was exhausted, spread thin along a frozen front. The German counteroffensive, the Battle of the Bulge, had begun. In that storm of ice and fire, the Charmer rumbled on, black smoke curling from its exhaust. Its mismatched armor was now coated in frost, its paint chipped to bare steel. Inside, the air reeked of oil and sweat. Kowalski sat behind the gun, coughing into a rag, his hands trembling but steady when they touched metal. They had been fighting for 48 hours straight. The engine barely held together, but it still roared when he hit the throttle. Every clang, every vibration was familiar, the heartbeat of the monster he'd built. That morning, the Charmer was assigned to cover a retreating infantry platoon near Bastogne. Snow drifted across the valley, muffling sound. Then came the shape of enemy armor moving through the haze. 3 Panthers, dark and patient. The first shells struck near their position, spraying snow and mud. The second tore through a nearby half-track. Radio chatter broke into panic. The Americans were pinned. Kowalski's commander shouted, "We're outgunned! Fall back!" He shook his head. "Not her," he said. "She doesn't back up." He jammed the gear shift forward. The Charmer lurched out of the tree line, its patched armor groaning. It moved faster than it had any right to. The gun thundered, one shot, then another. The first round clipped a Panther's track. The second hit dead center. Flames burst through the snow. German guns zeroed in. A shell slammed into the Charmer's side, tearing through its improvised armor. Kowalski's crew screamed for him to get out. He didn't. He kept loading. Smoke filled the cabin. Fire licked through the floorboards. The tank was dying, but still fighting. Kowalski climbed into the driver's seat, his face streaked with soot. "One more," he muttered. "Just one more." He drove straight into the line of enemy armor, firing until the ammunition ran dry. The Charmer shuddered, stopped, then erupted in flame. When reinforcements arrived hours later, they found the tank blackened but upright, frozen in place, its barrel still pointing toward the enemy. Inside, Kowalski's body was fused to the metal controls, a wrench still clutched in his burned hand. They covered him with his jacket, the same one he'd used once to patch the suspension spring. The Charmer was never moved. The soldiers left it there, half buried in snow, a shrine of twisted metal and willpower. For weeks afterward, men said they saw its outline through the fog, a tank that refused to stop moving, even after the man who built it was gone. They found his wrench frozen to the controls, welded there by heat and ice. It became the relic of a man who had refused to let go. Not of his machine, not of the fight, not of the idea that nothing was beyond saving. When word spread through the division, men didn't mourn with silence. They laughed. The kind of broken laughter soldiers use when words aren't enough. "Of course he went out with the engine running," one said. "He probably tuned it on the way to heaven." Command filed it as a loss in the morning reports. 1 tank destroyed, crew KIA, field repair impossible. But among the men, a different entry was written. Wrench fixed it too well. It wouldn't die without him. The line between madness and genius had always been blurred in war. Kowalski simply erased it. His obsession was more than technical skill. It was defiance against entropy, against the logic that said broken things stay broken. In a world ruled by statistics and attrition, he believed in something fragile and human, that willpower could bend steel. The Charmer was never recovered. Snow buried it. Then spring revealed only rust. But the story endured. The mad mechanic who built a legend out of wreckage. Every mechanic who came after knew his name. When a tank sputtered and groaned, someone would mutter, "Give her the Kowalski treatment," and keep working. He had become more than a man. He was a myth, welded into every wrench that turned under fire. In the end, it wasn't luck or brilliance that made him a legend. It was obsession, that dangerous, beautiful force that drives a person past fear, past exhaustion, past reason. Madness and genius may be opposites in peace, but in war, they're the same engine running at full throttle. And somewhere in the Ardennes, when fog rolls thick over the frozen trees, soldiers still swear they can hear it. A faint mechanical heartbeat, a ghost coughing to life, the charmer rumbling once more. Peter Wrench Kowalski never saw himself as a hero. He wasn't chasing medals or glory, just motion. He believed that as long as a machine could move, so could he. In war, that was enough. The charmer never made it to any museum. Its steel rusted into the soil of the Ardennes, feeding the ground it once defended. But its story lived, passed between mechanics, whispered in workshops, retold every time someone refused to give up on a hopeless engine. Because Kowalski proved something no blueprint ever could, that the line between madness and genius is drawn by results. Every war leaves behind men like him, the ones who see possibility in ruins, who can't stop fixing even when everything else has fallen apart. They don't make speeches. They make things work. Mortain, France. August 7th, 1944. The fog was thick, the kind that muffled sound and made the night feel endless. Beyond the hills, German tanks were moving, a deep rhythmic growl that rolled through the valley like thunder trapped underground. Colonel Paul F. Disney stood over a field map inside a ruined farmhouse. The windows rattled from distant artillery. His men, the 120th Infantry Regiment, had been ordered to hold this sector, no matter what. Headquarters' last transmission was clear. Do not engage offensively. Wait for authorization. Authorization wasn't coming. Through the static on the radio came fragments of chaos, outposts overrun, anti-tank guns silenced, an entire company disappearing without a word. Scouts reported columns of German armor cutting off the road west to Avranches, the artery feeding the entire Allied front. If that road fell, every tank in Patton's army would run dry. Disney's aide, a young lieutenant, looked pale. "Sir, HQ says hold position." Disney didn't look up. "We hold, we die." He stared at the map, then at the men outside, tired faces lit by the glow of cigarette tips, infantry without tanks, artillery with barely a dozen shells left, and somewhere in the mist, the 2nd SS Panzer Division advancing straight for them. He knew the rules. No counterattack without division command. No independent fire orders. The manuals were full of procedures. Neat, logical, suicidal. Disney folded the map. "Get me the artillery battery." The lieutenant hesitated. "Sir, that's unauthorized." "So is dying in silence." He turned to the radio operator. "Cut HQ frequency. Switch to local net." There was a pause, one of those moments that stretches a lifetime. Then the operator obeyed. Disney keyed the mic. "All batteries open fire. Target grid 628. Infantry will move on my command." In that instant, Paul F. Disney broke U.S. Army protocol, international law, and the sacred chain of command. Outside, the first American shells screamed into the fog. By dawn, the German offensive at Mortain, Operation Lüttich, had smashed straight into his illegal counterattack. And somewhere in the chaos, the 120th Infantry was still standing. He should have been court-martialed. Instead, he would become the man who saved an entire division by doing everything he wasn't supposed to do. Every army builds itself on one promise, that discipline wins wars. Orders flow downward, obedience flows upward, and the machine stays intact. That belief kept millions of soldiers moving across continents. It also nearly destroyed them. In theory, order creates strength. But in practice, by the summer of 1944, order had become a cage. Communication across the Allied front lagged hours behind reality. Commanders at corps level issued instructions for battles that had already changed shape. Men in the field were told to hold at all costs while enemy tanks surrounded them. That's what happened at Mortain. Colonel Paul F. Disney wasn't a renegade by nature. He had built his career on precision and discipline. But by August, he had learned that command from afar could kill faster than bullets. The higher the rank, the older the map. When orders came to await authorization, the situation on the ground was already collapsing. Mortain was surrounded by panzers. The Germans weren't probing. They were striking for the coast. Their goal was Avranches, the single road connecting Normandy to the rest of France. If they cut that lifeline, the entire Allied invasion could be trapped and starved. And yet the order stood. No movement, no counterattack, no initiative. In theory, that made sense. Coordinated control prevents friendly fire, avoids chaos, and ensures unity. But it assumes that communication survives the battle. It assumes someone at headquarters can still see the truth. Disney could see it. Through the fog, through the smoke, through the slow unraveling of his regiment's lines. He could hear it in the silence on the radio, the calls that never came back. He realized that obedience in that moment meant annihilation. So he broke the rule that every officer swore to uphold. And in doing so, proved why that rule couldn't survive real war. The myth of discipline as the ultimate weapon had blinded armies for generations. But at Mortain, one man's defiance showed that war was not a science of obedience. It was a geometry of instinct, judgment drawn in fire. He didn't disobey to be a hero. He disobeyed because no one else could see the map in front of him, and by the time headquarters understood, he had already changed the course of the battle. By the first week of August 1944, the Allied front in Normandy looked unstoppable on paper. Patton's armored columns were racing through Brittany. Montgomery's divisions pressed east toward Paris. And Eisenhower's headquarters believed the Germans were finished. But beneath that optimism was a flaw that every soldier on the ground could feel: command paralysis. The Allied chain of command had grown heavy, like an engine with too many gears. Orders passed through layers of coordination, translated, reapproved, delayed. A directive from Bradley's 12th Army Group could take 6 hours to reach a colonel under fire. Radios crackled with half-finished sentences. Wires were cut by shell fire. And by the time orders arrived, they no longer fit the battlefield that existed. At Mortain, that flaw would be exposed brutally. Operation Lüttich, Hitler's last attempt to throw the Allies back into the sea, was already underway. He had ordered 4 panzer divisions, including the elite 2nd SS Das Reich and 116th Panzer, to strike west toward Avranches. If successful, they would sever Patton's supply line and trap the entire U.S. Third Army. For the men of the 30th Infantry Division, it meant facing over 120 German tanks, with little more than rifles, bazookas, and a handful of anti-tank guns. The division held a front that stretched 5 miles, defended by barely 700 men. Disney's regiment, the 120th Infantry, sat right in the middle of that storm. His orders were simple: hold the line. But every scout report told a different story. German armor moving in formation, artillery zeroing in, American outposts vanishing without a signal. When he radioed division command for updates, he got static. The phone lines were dead. The nearest tank battalion was already retreating south. Still, the command structure remained frozen. The manuals demanded coordination. The generals demanded discipline, even as the enemy surrounded them. No one authorized a counterattack. The irony was cruel. The Allies had built the most organized fighting machine in history. But on the ground, that same organization became quicksand. Orders took too long to move. Decisions arrived too late. Colonel Disney saw it for what it was: a perfect plan for losing. Inside his command tent, he studied his situation map. The red lines marking enemy positions closed around his regiment like claws. He knew if he followed procedure, his men would be gone before dawn. War, he realized, had turned into a waiting game, and the ones who waited died first. So he made a decision that no radio, no manual, and no general could ever authorize. He would take command of his own war. Every legend begins with numbers that make survival look impossible. Mortain was one of those places. On paper, the 30th Infantry Division was holding firm. In reality, it was being swallowed. At 0200 hours on August 7, 1944, the German attack began. The opening of Operation Lüttich. 6 panzer divisions struck west through the fog, including the 2nd SS Das Reich and the 1st SS Leibstandarte. Together they fielded more than 120 tanks and 5,000 infantry, supported by heavy artillery and Luftwaffe bombers. Against them stood roughly 700 men of the 120th Infantry Regiment, most dug into shallow foxholes short on ammunition, with only a dozen functioning anti-tank guns and 3 57mm pieces. The ratio was absurd, nearly 10 German soldiers for every American. Communications delays made everything worse. Field reports later showed an average 90-minute gap between a frontline distress call and headquarters acknowledgement. When a position fell, it often took half a day before the higher command even realized it. The radio net was clogged, the lines cut, and the chain of command, that perfect pyramid of authority, had turned into a dead circuit. Meanwhile, Hitler's plan was explicit. The panzers were to push straight to Avranches, cut off Patton's Third Army, and isolate the Allied beachhead in Normandy. If they succeeded, the entire Allied advance, over 250,000 men, would be trapped between the sea and the German line. The weight of that math was unbearable. The 30th Division wasn't just fighting for itself. It was the wall standing between the Allies and catastrophe. By 0400, the first German tanks reached Disney's sector. Panthers rolled out of the fog, their engines growling like engines of inevitability. American bazookas bounced off their armor. A single shell from a Panther's 75mm gun could vaporize a squad. Disney's artillery had 5 minutes of shells left. His anti-tank guns were already burning. The last message from headquarters told him to hold ground, await further instruction. There would be no instruction. He looked at the faces of the men around him. Farm boys from Iowa, machinists from Ohio, kids who'd been told discipline was stronger than steel. He saw their rifles trembling, not from fear, but from understanding. They were being ordered to die by the book. That's when Disney made his choice. If the math of war couldn't save them, then he'd change the equation himself. It wasn't bravery. It was arithmetic, the only kind that made sense when the difference between obedience and extinction was one radio transmission too late. At 0430 hours, the fog at Mortain was so thick that visibility dropped to 20 yards. The Germans were ghosts, engines without shapes, steel moving through smoke. The ground trembled as panzers advanced uphill toward the 120th Infantry's position. Inside a shattered farmhouse that served as command post, Colonel Paul F. Disney stood over the radio. Static. The line to division command was dead again. His artillery forward observer shouted from outside, "They're coming through the orchard!" The order from higher command still sat on the table. Hold. Do not engage offensively. Disney read it once more, folded the page, and slid it into his pocket. To hell with that, he turned to his staff. We're counterattacking. The room went silent. One of his captains blinked. Sir, that's not authorized. Disney lit a cigarette with hands that didn't shake. Neither is dying in formation. Tell the men to fix bayonets. He stepped outside into the fog where his soldiers were crouched in trenches. Listen up, he shouted. The panzers are blind in this soup. We hit them now or they roll over us. No one's coming to save us. We save ourselves. No one argued. He coordinated his artillery manually without clearance, ordering his gunners to open fire on pre-sighted coordinates. Within seconds, the quiet hills erupted, a line of explosions tearing through the mist. The German advance staggered, momentarily disoriented. "Move!" Disney yelled. Infantry squads surged forward, slipping through mud and smoke. Mortars fired blind, shells bursting in the fog. The Americans closed to within 50 yards before the Germans even realized they were counterattacking. It wasn't strategy, it was instinct. The fog, the terrain, and the timing turned what should have been suicide into chaos the Germans couldn't read. They had expected a static defense. Instead, they ran into fury. Disney moved with the first wave, shouting orders, dragging a machine gun crew forward when one man froze. His voice cut through the artillery like steel on stone. Panzer shells tore craters around them. A fragment grazed his shoulder. He didn't stop. "Keep moving. They're not gods, they're just men in metal." By 0700, his illegal offensive had punched straight into the German flank. His regiment recaptured the crossroad west of Mortain, the supply artery that had been considered lost. From that position, his artillery could finally see the German column spread along the valley. Disney grabbed the field phone. "Fire for effect, full battery." 6 American guns answered. The shells rained into the convoy, detonating fuel trucks, flipping half-tracks. The hillside glowed orange through the fog. At 0900, the counterattack, entirely unauthorized, entirely improvised, had collapsed the German spearhead. The 2nd SS Panzer's lead units were forced to pull back. When the smoke cleared, the 120th Infantry was still standing. One major walked up to Disney, shaking his head. "Sir, that move was illegal as hell." Disney smiled faintly, eyes red from smoke. "Then let's hope the law never finds us." His men laughed, not from relief, but disbelief. Against every rule, every number, and every plan, they were alive. And somewhere in the fog, the Panzers were not. When the fog lifted, the battlefield looked like an equation solved in fire. Burned-out tanks lay nose down in ditches. German infantry fled across open fields, leaving weapons behind. What began as a forbidden counterattack had detonated into a chain reaction that changed the entire front. By the time higher command realized what Disney had done, the outcome was already irreversible. His illegal maneuver had broken the timing of the German offensive. The 2nd SS and 116th Panzer Divisions, which were supposed to strike together, were now separated by several miles. Their flanks were exposed, their communication lines shattered. That 12-hour delay was everything. It gave the U.S. the 1919 Corps enough time to reposition reserves and bring in the 35th Infantry Division from the south. By nightfall, Allied air power had cleared, and fighter-bombers roared over Mortain like a curtain of thunder. Disney's defiance had bought the sky back. The math of the battle was staggering. Within 48 hours, the German counteroffensive lost over 3,000 men and 120 vehicles, including 40 tanks. The advance that Hitler believed would collapse the Allied front never got past Mortain. And the irony was cruel. Every Allied after-action report credited coordinated resistance for the victory. No one mentioned the order that was never given, or the man who had broken every regulation to make it happen. If Disney had waited for permission, his regiment would have been erased before sunrise. Avranches would have fallen. Patton's Third Army, 250,000 men, would have been stranded without fuel or ammunition. Normandy could have turned into a second Dunkirk. Instead, one colonel's refusal to wait rewrote the tempo of the war. Headquarters eventually sent new orders, but they arrived 12 hours too late. They told him to prepare a controlled withdrawal. He laughed, tore the message in half, and kept fighting. In the end, his insubordination didn't just save a regiment. It saved a corridor of survival stretching across France. The chain of command had frozen. He had become the missing link that forced it to move again. And though history would write the victory as methodical, the men who were there knew the truth. It was born from disobedience, calculated by instinct and signed in artillery smoke. At first light on August 8th, the fog began to thin. Mortain was still burning, the air thick with cordite and smoke. But the sound of battle was shifting, from chaos to rhythm. The Germans had lost their momentum, their panzers scattered along the valley floor. And in the middle of it all, Colonel Paul Disney's regiment was still moving. A young lieutenant from Disney's staff later described that morning, "It didn't feel like victory. It felt like we were still inside a thunderstorm that didn't know which way to roll." Disney's men moved along the narrow road to Avranches, clearing pockets of resistance. The asphalt was cratered, the fields beside it littered with twisted steel. In places, German half-tracks smoldered with black smoke, their crews still slumped over the guns. "Keep that road open," Disney shouted over the noise. "If it closes, we lose the whole war." He rode in an open jeep, mud spraying over his uniform. Radio chatter crackled. German armor regrouping north of Hill 314. Infantry digging in near the church ruins. The colonel ordered his 2nd Battalion to flank left and hold the ridge. Hill 314 wasn't just high ground. It was an observation point that commanded the entire valley. Whoever held it could direct artillery on everything that moved below. Disney climbed the slope with his forward observers, using field glasses to peer through the smoke. Below them, the German column was trying to reform, tanks refueling, infantry pulling back under fire. "Get me Battery C," he said into the radio. "Target coordinates 271, full salvo." The guns answered moments later. The first shell landed squarely on a fuel truck, the second on a tank convoy. The valley erupted in a chain of explosions that rolled like thunder through the morning haze. From that hill, Disney's regiment directed fire for the next 6 hours. Every German attempt to advance ended in flame. 68 vehicles were destroyed in a single morning. Infantrymen below joked that the colonel was painting with artillery. By noon, Allied fighter bombers arrived, P-47 Thunderbolts screaming low over the valley. Pilots later said the smoke columns rising from Disney's coordinates were so precise they didn't need ground markers. From the top of Hill 314, he watched the panzers burn and said quietly, "That's for the boys who didn't make it through the night." The road to Avranches stayed open. The German offensive stalled for good. But as the day ended, the cost of defiance began to weigh on him. He knew his actions had violated every regulation. He knew reports would reach headquarters. Yet watching the last Panther explode in the distance, he didn't care. He turned to his lieutenant and said, "If this was illegal, then maybe war needs more crime." When the guns finally fell silent over Mortain, the valley looked like the wreckage of a machine that had run itself to death. Smoke drifted low across fields of twisted armor. The 120th Infantry held its ground, but the price was everywhere. Burned trucks, shattered helmets, men who hadn't slept in 2 days. Colonel Paul F. Disney stood beside a wrecked jeep, drinking black coffee that tasted like gunpowder. His uniform was torn, his face gray with soot. Someone handed him a message from division headquarters. It wasn't congratulations. He was ordered to report immediately to Corps Command for review of unauthorized action under combat conditions. The words hit harder than any artillery shell. The war wasn't over for him, not yet. 2 days later, he walked into the command tent of the 30th Infantry Division. General Hobbs sat behind a field desk, expression unreadable. Around him were staff officers, maps, and a thick folder marked Morton Incident. Disney saluted. "Sir, I take full responsibility." Hobbs looked at him for a long moment. "You counterattacked without authorization. You opened fire before confirmation. You broke radio silence." "Yes, sir. And in doing so, you saved my entire division." The tent went quiet. Hobbs closed the folder. "Do you have any idea what would have happened if you hadn't acted?" Disney hesitated. "Yes, sir." "We'd be gone." The general leaned back, exhaled. "You're not going to see a medal for this, Colonel. Not today. maybe not ever. Officially, you disobeyed orders. Unofficially, he paused. You gave me a reason to believe in judgment again. The court-martial recommendation disappeared into the paper fog of bureaucracy. The file was never processed. A single note replaced it. Action justified by operational success. Headquarters didn't speak of it again. The reports credited effective local command initiative for halting the German offensive. No mention of disobedience. No mention of law broken to save law itself. Years later, when the war was over and the records declassified, historians found fragments, field transmissions, after-action notes, artillery logs that didn't match official orders. The truth surfaced slowly, like wreckage from the deep. Disney had indeed ignored every standing order, and by doing so, he'd altered the course of the battle that secured the Allied breakout from Normandy. He retired quietly after the war. No decorations beyond the usual campaign ribbons. When asked about Mortain, he only said, "Sometimes you don't wait for permission to do what's right." The men who had fought under him remembered differently. To them, he wasn't the colonel who broke rules. He was the one who broke the silence that was killing them. And though the archives called him a disciplinarian, the front remembered him as something else entirely. The man who made disobedience holy for one night in Normandy. History likes order. It prefers neat timelines, proper approvals, victories achieved through obedience. It doesn't know what to do with men like Colonel Paul F. Disney, the ones who see a disaster coming and decide to ignore the system that made it inevitable. At Mortain, the manual said wait for command. He didn't. They said preserve formation. He broke it. They said discipline wins wars. He proved judgment does. In the chaos of total war, the difference between a hero and a criminal is measured in outcomes, not orders. If Disney's counterattack had failed, he would have been court-martialed, stripped of command, maybe imprisoned. The same act that saved thousands would have condemned one man. That's the paradox of command. When the system freezes, it takes one defiant voice to keep it alive. The German generals after the war admitted that Mortain was their breaking point. "We had the men, the tanks, the plan," one wrote. But the Americans did not behave logically. They counterattacked through fog and fire, as if they had no fear. What they didn't know was that logic had been thrown away, replaced by necessity and instinct. Disney's mutiny never made it into official histories. His name didn't appear in textbooks or documentaries. But the silence around him speaks louder than medals ever could. He became the invisible proof that order alone cannot win a war. Armies need men willing to see beyond instructions, men who can tell the difference between obedience and surrender. "Discipline builds an army," one of his sergeants said years later, "but judgment keeps it alive." That was the math of Mortain. One unauthorized act multiplied by courage equaled survival for thousands. When war ended, Disney packed away his uniform. Never spoke about that night again. But those who were there still remembered the moment he looked at the radio, heard nothing from command, and said softly, "Then I'll speak for them." And with that, he reminded the world that sometimes the most lawful act in war is to break the law that's killing you. Colonel Paul F. Disney never received a medal for Mortain. No ceremony, no citation, no recognition beyond a few quiet handshakes from the men who lived because of him. History recorded his regiment's stand as effective resistance under difficult conditions. Nothing about the order he ignored, or the silence he defied. But every soldier who survived that valley knew the truth. That discipline might win parades, but judgment wins wars. Disney retired in silence. He never defended what he did, never glorified it. When asked years later whether he regretted disobeying orders, he said only, "I regret that obedience would have killed us." The chain of command still needed men like him, ones willing to break it when the system broke first.